in trying to change, whether it is to change direction or to change certain aspects of the day, of oneself, of one's direction in life, and introducing new things, then there are certain leverages that can be used. Just like one can use a stone or an object in order to put by the bedside to remind one of how to wake up in lucid dreaming, like I had made a video about it before, that initiating the object with the function that it has the ability to wake up oneself in a dream. So too we could introduce different objects that can have functions in order to create change in the day, or in a week, or in any span of time, in the sense that in order to help us, or to help oneself to move towards in a specific direction. Of course, one can use sheer volition, the sheer power of willpower, in order to just break through towards any desired direction. But grace is also desired, and by grace I mean having the world around you and within you flow in the same direction, be an aiding, not a guide, but an aiding force towards that direction that might have obstacles in front of it. So, again, using, let's say, different objects, although it doesn't have to be objects, right? We tend to use them, let's say, meditation, in order to feel more calm, in order to feel more aware, and to move with more grace. So we're actually using, in meditation, our body, our mind, our breath, various techniques within meditation, such as counting, or just focusing on empty space, or on our own body. So we create, we're initializing in meditation, for example, initializing our body as an object, initializing a form such as breathing, or meditating and focusing on empty space, initializing a form in order to create a sense of aid towards a desired direction. Now that direction can be simply just to calm down, which is the most basic form of meditation. But it doesn't have to be only meditation, right? It can be any object. We can, to give a more complicated example, one could start to introduce in one's room or in one's house different objects that are initialized throughout each day. So let's say once a day, or once a week, or spontaneously introduce and initialize these objects to have a specific function. Now these functions can be, of course, whatever decisions that we decide to make as to what we want. Let's say we want to change our eating habits, or we want to not feel as much sadness or anger or fear. So the objects that we would choose, the objects are completely a personal decision. It could be a completely new object, or an object that we've had for a long time. I talked about in another video about using a stone in order to initialize that stone to have a function in order to remember dreams in the morning. And so interact with it before you go to sleep, and then when you wake up in the morning, there's there when you wake up, so that it creates a connection that is tangible, that is physical, that you hold on to. So I actually interact with it physically before I go to bed, and put it by the bed, and then when I wake up in the morning, before I get out of bed, I interact with it again, creating a link between the intention before you go to sleep and after, and when you wake up. And it does work. It does work. The sincerity and the depths of which the interaction and the emotional charge and or the intentional charge with the idea and the object will have an additional function and help to play with the desired result, but generally speaking, it does work. And so too, it does work with objects just in general. And so it's kind of like, so the example I'm trying to create here is to, in a room or in the house or apartment, kind of creating a temple of for one's own well-being, the temple of one's own soul. Can be or maybe in a completely separate room, which would be more of a new age kind of concept or idea but it doesn't have to be in a separate room, because you do want it to not be a separate, of course this is completely up to the individual to decide. You can have a separate room that would be, let's say, called some like temple of the self, or the temple of one's soul. It may sound cheesy, but once these objects begin to actually be interacted with on a daily level, on a level of that it is present, even when you're not actively charging it, it is charging you, then throughout time and to whatever sincerity and intensity or grace and momentum that it has built up, will have this kind of snowball effect where, especially if these different objects converge with each other, right, that they're actually, that they can fit into each other well, then that effect takes its own momentum. And of course one might think, oh well, on a bad day it will completely, disprove that these things do not work. But it is precisely on the bad days that it is necessary to initiate or interact with objects, because those bad days are just showing the reaction that is from within you, or the reaction that is a relation that one has with a specific, let's say, difficulty or obstacle. And sure, that obstacle can be new, and it's it's a challenge that hasn't been faced before. But imagine how that challenge, that new challenge or old challenge, would be dealt with without the aid of those, let's say, objects, those which would be for the self, kind of like almost sacred objects. I don't want to say sacred because I don't want to. It's maybe not healthy to have like a complete duality, but in a way, it's creating a contrast between the objects that are put in this in the house and around oneself and one's environment, including the body. So you have a contrast. You feel good, and you gain like this, to use the word momentum, of grace, of well-being, and then a difficulty arises that is slapping you in the face and saying, this is the unexpected. Well, in one sense, if we're already upset and we're already sad and already angry and already in fear, that new challenge will be, well, not not a huge contrast, right? So it won't bother you as much because you kind of expect it. But staying in that state of fear is, of course, also undesirable. But so with the notion that we are feeling good and we're creating our own grace and we're inviting grace in a larger context and well-being, then of course the difficulty will be a huge contrast, and it will create anxiety or anger or sadness or whatever that is unexpected, and therefore is creates this contrast that, well, I'm not used to feeling fear anymore, I'm not used to feeling anger anymore, or whatever, sadness. It will be a shock and say, well, this is this worse than being already negatively charged and facing these negative charges and just basically dealing with the familiarity of, well, I'm already angry, already sad, already in fear. Therefore, if any of these negative emotions or negative occurrences happen, then I just shrug it off because it's expected and I just deal with it like that. But that isn't desirable in itself, is it? Right? It's like becoming that which you did not want to become, but simply in order to numb yourself. It's like, well, it doesn't bother me, but it affects everything else, right? It affects the worldview, and it affects the potential. Now, of course, it doesn't mean you can't use anger or sadness or fear in order to motivate oneself, but do you really want that to be the center? Of course, this is a taster's choice. So to go back to the idea of creating grace and positive sense of well-being with positive emotions, which is hope, inspiration, love, and strength, power, right? A sense of power. There's no need for fear. Anger and power are very similar, but actually, anger is a desperate attempt to gain back power. Right? Whereas in a positive sense, it isn't a desperate attempt. The power is deeply anchored within oneself. And so when something negative happens, when we're feeling powerful, then it is challenging that power and we're feeling shock. Right? There is that contrast. So it is not. So these objects aren't to take away the negative aspects in a sense, but it's just to make the positive ones more powerful, more anchored, so that we're not completely unbalanced when negative things happen. And when positive things happen, right? When really positive things happen that are in direct relation to what one has been working towards, right? Especially if you're asking or if you're building towards creating a synchronicity, right? You're speaking to the world, you're speaking to your own soul, you're speaking to the great energy of the universe that is alive, and it responds to you in a form, let's say, of synchronicity or a dream or something really truly extraordinary. The amount of energy that is gained from that, right? You're connecting to something that is infinitely large, or that is beyond just the immediate world view of every day. It is so far beyond the regular observation of things that it will charge you with a much larger perspective, to the point where that power is going to be anchored within you, that you have that power to create that. And that, I think, most definitely, is worth more than numbing yourself to the good, to the potential good, with fear, anger, and sadness and whatever other negative emotions of anxiety, that positive relation, connection, and that is created in a sense of feeling alive and that is responded to is worth infinitely more and is a truly beautiful thing. And that's what I'm trying to say, is that creating these objects and putting these objects, and of course I'm using this in a very new way, in a sense that I've just started this myself, right? And I'm just sharing it because, well, I'm wondering if anybody else is thinking about these things, and I do know of people who do this. Or actually, women tend to do this more than men, or traditionally anyway, where they would put objects that are aesthetically pleasing or that have personal meaning, and they put it in the apartment, right? Like, women tend to be the interior designers of homes and of the apartment or the house, where they're decorated, and some women do it very well with creating a positive environment. And this positive environment is then reflected when you spend time in it. Now, of course, some people might not like the taste of another person, but like, that's what I'm saying. Like, some women do it better than others, in the sense that, or they just do it whatever corresponds to themselves. And whether that speaks to another person or not is well, maybe irrelevant, but men tend to have more a functional relationship with objects that are either outside of the house, right? Work, friends, sports, or I mean, not to say that they don't have anything inside the house or the home, but the primary emphasis is on the function, instead of the actual objects, right? To get things done. And so this would be, maybe could be seen as more of a feminine way to create grace. And grace is traditionally seen as a more feminine trait, whereas sheer power of the will, of volition, is more seen as a male aspect. But I mean, men and women have both, and me as a man, of course, I've been taught to use this idea of just using the sheer willpower, and of course I feel at home with that kind of mentality. But I think it's been that idea of just gung-hoing straightforward A to B or A to Z, that idea of just going straight to what is desired, that function of the volition of just breaking through everything and going forward. Of course, it's primordial in order to be able to do that and to exercise that and to function with that. But I think that grace has kind of lost its value in the minds of people, and that this idea of grace, where you create an environment that is actually conducive to where the willpower wants to go. Why would you not use both? Unless, of course, the exercise or the exercise of the volition of willpower is a test, then yeah, then of course that is great. That is a category in itself. But aside from that, wouldn't it just be a pride thing? It's like, hey, I want to see like how much I can achieve with just willpower. Well, that's fine too. That's a category in itself. But when it's just creating hubris, where I can do everything just with sheer willpower, why not create an environment that will be conducive to it to become more efficient? To become more efficient in order to get the desired results achieved, and being able to achieve more. Well, so there is one possibility that comes to mind, that to counter, as a counter argument, and it'll be, well, the volition will always be there and can always be relied upon, whereas the grace that is created is contingent on on the integrity of the object still being there, right? So if, let's say, the objects are lost or whatever, but or the body goes through some difficulty, like the first and last, or the last line of defense is the volition, or is the willpower, therefore should be the one being used. But that's not entirely the case, because grace is not only in the physical object, and it's not only in the body. As I would argue, it's also in your relation to your soul, right? It's that relation you have to all the objects in the world. And that could be symbolized, that could be energized, so to speak, that could be initiated, and these objects could be used as sort of conductors, if you will, of these, assuming that the ideas that are in your best interest and towards your greater goods. They're just, it's kind of like saying, well, I'm not going to use a car because eventually this car might break down. Right? So it's being practical in that sense, where you're creating objects, or you're using objects to move forward in certain directions, or if moving is the way you want to go, or you want to create stillness or a sense of sacred space. That idea of grace seems underused, and where a lot of people, and rightly so, but I think it's half the equation is this powering forward, or power for the sake of power, which I'm all for, of course. Obviously, it's a good in itself, right? You want to feel powerful. You want to discover your volition. You want to be able to anchor yourself in this true form of the self. But we do live in if an individual were to be the only existent being in the universe, in the cosmos, if it was just you, then yes, volition would be not only the only thing in the universe, but the only necessary thing as well, right? There's nothing else to interact with. And so it's basically just a self on the self. And this self on the self, you either act or you don't act. When you do act, you're exercising your volition. When you don't act, and you're just feeling your lack, or you have this sentient quality of just being, this infinite being, which in a way would be the grace that I'm talking about, but there's no other object instead of the self. But in a complex finite forms, or in a complex cosmos of forms, right, in the world where there are other things, there are other beings, there is a relationship with the volition that makes existence more interesting, right? I mean, just being by just the self would become boring, and if there were to be a choice to create other things, you probably would, I would, and start in creating what we have now, more or less, in the sense that, you're creating a world of objects, of other beings, and so on and so forth. And so the use of one's own volition is to create desired results, or to just create. Sometimes we create things not because we desire them, but because we're out of curiosity, or for destructive tendencies. Sometimes destructive tendency is just an exercise of one's own power. If we haven't felt power, then we're like, well, and there's a frustration that builds in, then we go through a destructive tendency in order to jump kick our sense of control, or sense of power. So we do use volition for that, like in order to create power, but that doesn't have to be only for volition's sake, or only for the immediate effect, right? I mean, if we want a most immediate effect, then volition is the go-to tool. But in a longer perspective in time, creating a vehicle, right, or using a vehicle in order to create grace in motion, right? Use a car to get somewhere faster, use a horse, right? You want to cross a lake or an ocean, maybe you use a boat, right? And so the idea here is that using objects could facilitate things and actually make maybe certain things possible that would otherwise be, well, not to say impossible, because in the abstract realm of volition, the impossible doesn't make sense, right? Abstractly speaking. But in the practical, why not give it a shot? I mean, that's what I'm doing right now. And, well, maybe I'll make a video about it later.